At 20,000 feet, the air is a thief. It steals your breath, your warmth, and eventually, your mind. The K2-Alpha Observatory was the most advanced telescope on Earth until a massive ice shelf collapse sheared off the oxygen lines and buried the facility under 40 feet of packed snow. Trapped in the death zone with no power and fading vision, the astronomers were hours from freezing. But the peak had a ghost, Yeti, a thick-furred white Turkish van cat who had been born in the blizzard. This is the story of the cat who walked through the whiteout. The guardian of the silent peak. Chapter 1, The King of the Cold. The K2-Alpha Observatory sat like a silver crown upon a jagged throne of granite and ice. At 20,000 feet, the atmosphere is so thin that the stars don't twinkle, they burn with a steady, surgical light. It was a world of absolute extremes, where the wind screamed at 100 miles per hour and the oxygen was a luxury the body had to fight for. Inside the pressurized domes, a team of astronomers lived in a bubble of warm, recirculated air, peering into the deep past of the universe while ignoring the lethal present just outside the glass. In this kingdom of frost lived Yeti. He was a Turkish van cat, a breed known for its love of water, but Yeti had adapted for the ice. His coat was a masterpiece of biological engineering, a thick, double-layered pelt of pure white that was indistinguishable from the surrounding snowbanks. He was a heavy, muscular cat with paws that acted like natural snowshoes, spreading his weight so perfectly that he could walk across a fresh drift without sinking. He had arrived at the station as a tiny kitten tucked inside a supply pilot's parka, and he had never seen the world below the clouds. Yeti was the only resident of the peak who didn't fear the death zone. While the scientists moved with the sluggish precision of those on constant oxygen, Yeti was a blur of energy. He navigated the external solar arrays and the sub-zero maintenance catwalks with a predatory calm. His eyes were his most striking feature, one a piercing sapphire blue like the deep ice, and the other a burning gold like the high-altitude sun. He was a ghost of the summit, a silent hunter who lived in the cracks between the technology and the mountain. To the astronomers, Yeti was a symbol of resilience. He didn't need the complex life support systems to survive, he thrived on the raw elements. He spent his nights curled up on the warm heat sink of the primary telescope, watching the nebula and galaxies rotate overhead with a detached, celestial wisdom. He was a creature of the heights, and the thin, freezing air was the only atmosphere he had ever known. He was a king in a realm where humans were merely guests, and he took his duties as the summit's guardian very seriously. But Yeti's connection to the mountain went deeper than the scientists realized. He could feel the shift in the barometric pressure in his whiskers long before the digital sensors logged it. He understood the groan of the tectonic plates and the subtle, terrifying sound of a building ice shelf. While the humans relied on their satellites and their code, Yeti relied on a million years of instinct. As the winter of the century began to settle over the Himalayas, Yeti sensed that the mountain was preparing to take back the peak. Chapter 2, The White Wall. The catastrophe didn't come with the roar of a storm, it came with the snap of a glacier. Deep beneath the observatory's foundation, a localized earthquake triggered a blue avalanche, a massive slab of ancient, compressed ice that had been frozen for millennia. In an instant, the mountainside gave way, sending 1 million tons of frozen debris cascading toward the facility. It didn't just bury the K2-Alpha. It acted like a giant fist, shearing off the external oxygen tanks and crushing the primary heating modules into scrap metal. The lights in the observatory flickered once and then died, replaced by the ghastly, pulsing red of the emergency batteries. The sound of the wind was suddenly gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence as 40 feet of packed snow sealed the facility from the world. Inside, the temperature began to drop with a predatory speed. The breath of the astronomers came in thick, silver plumes of fog, and frost began to bloom on the high-tech lenses of the telescopes. They were buried alive in a high-altitude freezer. Dr. Kale, the lead astronomer, struggled to find his footing in the dark. He checked the life support monitors, the oxygen lines were severed, and the internal heaters were dead. They had less than 4 hours before the cold turned their blood to ice. The emergency doors were bent inward by the crushing weight of the avalanche, making it impossible to dig their way out. The perfect facility had become a tomb of titanium and glass, and the rescue teams in the valley wouldn't even be able to fly until the weather cleared in 3 days. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the dim red glow of the failing electronics. The air was getting thinner, the lack of pressure making the scientists' heads throb and their vision blur. They huddled together in the center of the control room, wrapped in every parka they could find, but the mountain was a patient killer. The cold was moving through the metal walls, turning the air into a weapon. They were at the mercy of the peak, and the peak showed no mercy to the weak. Yeti, however, was in his element. To him, the darkness was a playground, and the cold was an old friend. He watched the humans from the top of the frozen server racks, his jewel-colored eyes glowing in the red light. He felt the change in the air, the way it was becoming stale and heavy. He knew the paths through the ventilation shafts that were still clear, and he knew that there was still one place on the peak where the light could be found. He leaped down into the frost, his paws silent on the freezing floor. Chapter 3: The Frozen Compass. Dr. Kale knew there was a final contingency. In the crow's nest, a small, auxiliary observation dome located 100 yards up the mountain, there was a manual thermal flare. If triggered, it would send a heat signature so intense that it would be picked up by the global rescue satellites, regardless of the weather. But the only way to reach it was through the umbilical, a narrow, unheated maintenance tunnel that was now a pitch-black pipe of ice. At 20,000 feet, Kale knew he couldn't make the climb, he would collapse from hypoxia within minutes. He looked at the small hatch to the umbilical, then back at his team. They were fading, their eyes drifting shut as the cold and the thin air took their toll. Then, he felt a weight on his knee. Yeti was standing there, his white fur standing on end, his sapphire and gold eyes fixed on the hatch. Kale remembered that the crow's nest was where they kept the emergency dried fish rations. It was Yeti's favorite place. The cat didn't need a map, he knew the scent of that dome better than anyone. With shaking frozen fingers, Kale reached into the emergency kit and pulled out a magnesium striker, a small, rugged tool used for ignition. He tied it to Yeti's collar with a piece of paracord, his hands fumbling in the dark. He looked into the cat's eyes, the blue and the gold reflecting the desperation of a dying man. "Find the nest, Yeti," Kale whispered, his voice a rasping ghost of itself. "Find the spark." He opened the hatch, and a blast of 50 below zero air roared into the room. Yeti didn't hesitate. He dove into the tunnel, his muscular body disappearing into the blackness. The umbilical was a vertical nightmare, coated in black ice, a layer of frozen condensation so slick that even steel crampons would struggle to find a grip. But Yeti's claws were sharper and more precise than any mount in gear. He dug into the ice, his powerful legs driving him upward against the gravity and the wind. He was a white spark moving through the dark heart of the mountain. The tunnel was a windpipe for the blizzard outside. Every few seconds, a gust would howl through the cracks in the metal, threatening to blow Yeti back down the shaft. He flattened his heavy fur against the walls, becoming a low-profile anchor against the storm. He wasn't thinking about the scientists or the rescue, he was following the scent of the dry fish and the familiar vibration of the upper dome. He was the frozen compass of the K2-Alpha, and he was the only thing still moving on the summit. Chapter 4: The Ascent of the Ghost. The climb was a grueling test of feline endurance. Every breath Yeti took was a battle against the thinning oxygen, his lungs burning in the freezing air. His white fur was now encrusted with rime ice, making him look like a living sculpture of frost. But the Turkish van was built for the rugged mountains of his ancestors, and his six-toed grip allowed him to navigate the vertical bent of the pipe that would have been impossible for any other creature. He was the ghost of the ascent, a white shadow in a world of black. Halfway up, a support bracket inside the tunnel snapped under the weight of the snow above, partially collapsing the path. Yeti was pinned for a moment, the cold metal pressing against his ribs. He didn't panic, he used his extra strength to wiggle through the gap, the magnesium striker on his collar clinking against the steel. He was losing heat, his body shivering violently, but the instinct to reach the high ground was a fire that wouldn't go out. He was the summit soul, refusing to be buried. As he reached the upper hatch of the crow's nest, Yeti found it blocked by a wall of ice. He spent 10 minutes clawing at the frozen barrier, his paws bleeding but his resolve unbroken. He dug with a rhythmic, desperate energy until he felt the seal of the hatch give way. He tumbled into the small dome, a circular room of glass and brass that was now a beautiful, terrifying museum of frost. The air here was even colder than below, but the smell of the fish was strong. Yeti didn't go for the food. He looked at the emergency signaling unit in the center of the room. It was a manual thermal flare, a large glass-encased cylinder designed to be triggered by a human hand. The glass was thick, and the dial was frozen solid. Yeti circled the unit, his breath coming in short, frantic puffs. He didn't have hands to turn the dial, and he didn't have the strength to break the reinforced casing with his paws alone. He had to find another way to create the spark. He looked up at the high rafters of the dome, 30 feet above the floor. He knew that the only way to break the glass was with momentum. He began the climb once more, leaping from the equipment racks to the support beams, his claws clicking on the frozen brass. He reached the very apex of the dome, looking down at the red flare below. He was a white hunter in the rafters, preparing for the most important pounce of his life. The spark in the dark. Yeti launched himself from the rafters. He wasn't a cat jumping for a toy, he was a 15-pound projectile of fur and bone, fueled by gravity and the survival of his pride. He slammed into the glass casing with the force of a hammer, the impact sending a shockwave through his body. The glass spiderwebbed but didn't shatter. Yeti fell to the floor, stunned, his vision swimming. He looked at the red flare, then at the sky where the rescue satellites were silently passing overhead. He ignored the pain and climbed again. This time, he didn't just jump, he used the magnesium striker on his collar as a wedge. As he fell, he oriented his body so that the striker hit the weakened glass first. Crash! The casing exploded into 1,000 shards of crystalline glitter. The manual ignition strip of the flare was now exposed. Yeti landed on the console, his paws cut by the glass, but his eyes fixed on the magnesium strip. He took the striker in his teeth, pulling the paracord tight. He moved his head in a violent, jerking motion, dragging the striker across the flare's ignition surface. For a second, there was only the sound of the wind. Then, a shower of white sparks erupted, followed by a roar of crimson flame. The thermal flare ignited, a brilliant, magnesium-fueled sun that burned at 3,000 degrees. The heat was so intense it instantly melted the frost on the dome's windows, turning the crow's nest into a glowing ruby atop the mountain. The light was blinding, a crimson pillar that shot through the blizzard and into the edge of space. 100 miles above, the infrared sensors of a global rescue satellite flared to life, logging the massive heat signature at the K2-Alpha coordinates. The silent peak was silent no longer. The signal had been sent, and the digital eyes of the world were now fixed on the buried observatory. Yeti fell back from the heat, his white fur singed, his golden and blue eyes closing as the warmth of the flare began to seep into his bones. Down in the main dome, the astronomers saw the crimson glow reflecting through the ventilation shafts. The heat from the flare was traveling down the metal umbilical, raising the temperature in the control room just enough to stop the freezing process. He did it, Kale whispered, his breath no longer a fog but a clear, steady stream. They were no longer waiting for death, they were waiting for the sound of rotors. The white ghost had lit a fire that the mountain couldn't blow out. Chapter 6, The Summit Soul. The rescue helicopters arrived at dawn, their rotors fighting the thin air to hover over the buried peak. The rescuers used thermal cutters to break through the ice-clogged hatches, expecting to find a tomb. Instead, they found 12 astronomers huddled around the base of the umbilical, kept alive by the residual heat of the flare. But Kale wouldn't let them leave. He pointed upward, toward the crow's nest. "The cat," he gasped. "Don't leave the cat." The lead rescuer climbed to the upper dome and found Yeti lying on the floor, his white coat blackened by soot, his paws bandaged in frostbite. He was a small, broken shape in a room of shattered glass, but when the rescuer touched him, Yeti let out a low, defiant purr. He was carried down the mountain in a heated medical wrap, a hero whose story would soon be told in every language on the planet. That the guardian of the silent peak had cheated the death zone and won. Yeti didn't return to the observatory. The facility was decommissioned, the mountain having proven it was no place for human vanity. Today, Yeti lives in a sun-drenched vineyard in the valley with Dr. Kale. He spends his days chasing butterflies and sleeping in the shade of the grapevines, his white fur long since grown back. But on cold, clear nights, he still sits on the highest point of the roof, his blue and gold eyes looking up at the jagged, silver peaks above the clouds. The astronomers often visit, bringing with them the finest dried fish and stories of the new lives they lead. They know they are living on borrowed time, time that was bought for them by a six-toed cat and a magnesium striker. Yeti is the only cat in history to have a mountain peak named after him, but to him, the name doesn't matter. He knows the truth, the mountain is a giant, but even a giant can be conquered by a warm heart and a sharp claw. As the sun sets over the Himalayas, Yeti closes his eyes. He can still feel the vibration of the ice and the shriek of the high-altitude wind in his dreams. But then he feels the warmth of the sun on his fur and the scent of the valley in the air. He is the cat who walked through the whiteout, the spark in the dark, and the soul of the silent peak. He is home, and the mountain is finally, truly, at peace. Yeti was a small cat in a world of giants and ice, but when the mountain tried to take everything, he was the only one who stood his ground. He proved that even in the coldest places on Earth, a warm heart is the most powerful tool for survival. If Yeti's climb moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to Pause That Saved Lives. We tell the stories of the world's most incredible survivors. Comment peek below if you think animals are the true guardians of our world.